Welcome back, everyone. We're about to begin our panel discussion on climate smart actions, solutions that people are pursuing. In one case, it'll be the whole country in Costa Rica. Another, it'll be very specific about how it's working in some regions. But in all cases, what we're looking at this afternoon are examples when people have tackled both short-term issues that related to food security, but done it in a way that was addressing the underlying or more fundamental causes. In this case, first one will be climate. We're going to open with a good friend of Global Minnesota, Paula Caballero, who now serves as the Managing Director for the Lands for Life at RARE, an international biodiversity conservation organization. But we first began working with Paula when she was the author of and chief lobbyist globally for the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs that we're all so devoted to focusing on and moving forward in her role as part of the foreign ministry in Colombia. She and a group of colleagues around the Colombian foreign ministry and in other places came up with a very specific way of following up on the millennial goals, which they ended up calling Sustainable Development Goals, and coming up with the list and making them into the global movement that drives us so directly today and provides such a North Star for all of us. Paula's work and addressing climate-specific solutions is extraordinary. She's all over the planet, and we'll hear from her first. And then we'll be joined by the organization and one of the groups that was honored by the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation today, the Iowa tribe of Nebraska and Kansas. We'll be joined by Tim Rhodd, who is both the tribal chairman, the executive director, but he's also been one of the main drivers on their real transformation of their agriculture, their farm and their farming aspects of their operations there, and their program consultant and climate resilience staff person. So the scientist member of the tribe that's been part of this is Brett Ramey. He is also a program advisor and a consultant for that Regenerative Agriculture Foundation. So we'll be hearing about the specific things that they've been doing that has put more food on the table for their tribal members, but also address fundamental issues of climate. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Eduard Muller about the approaches that have been taken in Costa Rica. So these are opportunities to see where we can put our finger on something that can be helping address food security right now, but also we can see how they are part of much larger solutions that are addressing the underlying causes of why we've gone backwards the last couple of years in food insecurity. So let's roll this first interview, and thank you again for joining us for World Food Day 2021. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today at World Food Day 2021. Global Minnesota and partners around the planet are taking a good look, a comprehensive look at the impacts of climate, of COVID and conflicts on food security around the world, and what are people doing at the local level, at the regional, the national, and the international level to address the short-term issues and the long-term causes of these challenges, these threats to food and food survival and food sovereignty and food security around the planet. I'm really pleased to have a good friend and colleague for my next guest for today. Paula Caballero has been the Managing Director of Lands for Life program at RARE, one of the really amazing global institutions working on biodiversity and protection of the environment, promotion of the Sustainable Development Goals, something that's very close and dear to her, one of the original founders and the original creators of that concept and of those SDGs, as they're often called. Paula, it's wonderful to have you on today on our program. And we know that you've been focusing on questions around climate and climate change for a number of years, and you've seen the planet. You've been out in the communities throughout the world. Can you give us a sense of how has climate and the climate crisis been impacting food security, and how do you see that in community response that builds out the sort of resilience and the protection of food security that every single person on the planet must have?
Well, first of all, Mark, thank you very much for inviting me back. It's always great to chat with you. You're asking really very salient questions that are at the heart of the intersection of many of the crises that we're facing right now. I think we're facing the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis, and these intersect very neatly with the great opportunity that we have to really transition to an agriculture and to food systems, to fisheries that are much more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive, and that deliver not just a lot of environmental benefits, but long-term productivity for a lot of populations around the world, in particular, a lot of communities that are very vulnerable and that depend almost entirely on their access to these viable and hopefully very vibrant in the future food systems. The reality, though, is, as you well mentioned, is that climate change is already having huge impacts. We're seeing massive droughts in Madagascar, for example, where they're facing very, very serious issues of famine. We're seeing droughts impacting and exacerbating conflict in places like Ethiopia and Afghanistan. And even here in the US, we're seeing a very prolonged drought that is having and will continue to have very severe impacts, not just in terms of the wildfires, for example, that we're seeing, but water levels and water security for the medium and longer term. So the realities in terms of soil erosion, soil degradation, in terms of water scarcity, in terms of the lowering productivity of many crops. We're already seeing that, and these will impact hugely on populations and communities around the world. And this plays out obviously at national level. Countries with a lot less resources will be very strained to be able to provide the kind of solutions and support to their communities to be able to move onto more resilient trajectories. And one of the results of that we're already seeing are climate refugees. A lot of the people that we label economic refugees are really climate refugees, people who can really no longer eke out a living, no matter how hard they try, from their plots, from their land where they were born, because of a combination of climate change and also bad practices that have contributed also to soil erosion, soil degradation, and mismanagement of water resources. So it's a huge problem, but I would say that the big solution, or the big positive side that gives me optimism and that I'd like to focus on, is that sustainable and inclusive agriculture also holds the key to helping resolve and tackle effectively a lot of these crises.
Do you have some specific examples that you could help our audience see what some of these hopeful signs, what some of these inspiring examples looks like?
Sure. So one of the key aspects about agriculture is that it is a main source of what we all know now as greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, it's a driver of climate change. And a lot of these practices that drive climate change, if we change them, if we modify them to make them more sustainable, we can actually be part of the climate solution and at the same time increase the resilience. So there's a lot of momentum right now, for example, around soil health, because a good soil, a soil that is healthy, is a soil that can become what we know as a carbon sink. It can absorb that carbon, whereas soil that is overtilled and mismanaged becomes a source of these emissions. So good soil health not only delivers on the climate, but obviously if you have really rich soil health, for poor communities, it means that they're going to be spending a lot less money on unnecessary agrochemicals, and they're going to be ensuring the productivity of their land, not just for the short term, but what is really critical for the long term. Another really good example is just around trees. Agriculture has led to a pushing of the agricultural frontier in many cases. or to an understanding of what good farming or good ranching looks like, which is to cut down all the trees and just have entirely huge areas with either livestock or with monocrops. And sustainable agriculture or agroecology, there's many different terms for it, but agriculture that's more climate smart is also about putting the trees back into the land in terms of living fences and many other different approaches, silvopastoral systems. And again, putting the trees back in has all these dividends. And as we know, trees are a really key part of nature-based solutions so that we can, again, figure out ways of generating less emissions and of absorbing the emissions that may exist. I'm trying to put this simplistically because I know that it's a complicated matter, but at the end of the day, it's really simple. Agriculture can be a good solution.
Well, and this bringing together of these two concepts, I mean, even in the United States in our 1930s, when we talk about the Great Depression, but we talk about the beginnings being the dust storms and the blowing of sand and dust particles continental wide. This year we had fires with, soot. And so we know that these combination of proper practices, building up the soil and holding it in place with crops and with trees and all of these things can do those two, short-term and long-term. But you think about this, I know, also from a policy perspective, a larger territorial perspective, changing hearts and minds and practices takes a combination of things. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen that's been successful in places where they've kind of tackled it in that way that you're describing?
Certainly. I think that's a really good question, Mark. Let me tackle it from sort of two ends. On the one side, we need to provide the access to timely, to quality technical advice, agronomic advice to farmers so that they understand and are able to shift their practices. But a part of the problem that I have seen worldwide is that it's oftentimes very projectized. There's a lot of projects, and then the projects and the projects usually provide some kind of incentives. The incentives ends, and we're sort of right back where we started. So I would say that one of the really key aspects to success, to make the solution a reality, is to make these changes stick. And to make them stick, you need to have farmers just change their mindsets and communities. And you talk about policy, local leaders, changing the understanding of what good farming looks like, what an entire landscape, a productive landscape should look like. And changing those mindsets is something that we at RARE are very good at. And we work using a lot of behavior levers, but also community dynamics, the fact that human beings are very social animals. And we often follow the leaders. If we're given proof, tangible proof that something works, well, we may follow that. So there's a lot around the social dynamics that we can work on and the way that people are approached so that we really appeal to and support them as informed decision makers, not telling them what to do, but giving them agency and empowering them so that they have all of the information they need so that they can become informed producers who are better able to take all the decisions they need to take to make their farmings and their land productive for the short and long term. So that's at the sort of individual level and capitalizing on the social dynamics. But we also need both to deliver on the climate solution as well as ultimately on the productivity solution. We need entire territories, entire landscapes to change, not just a few scattered farmers, but everybody. And there again, the behavior change and the social dynamics play a really key role. Technology is going to be and is already being decisive. There's a lot of a huge plethora of these really amazing apps around the world that are making it more cost effective and easier for farmers, and even in remote areas, to be able to access timely and more information. So changing those mindsets is really important. But I think that another key aspect so that we can really mobilize entire territories is one, to engage local and regional authorities so that they're behind that. We have, for example, the governor's task force on climate and environment, if I get the name right, that was launched at the summit in California that took place 2 or 3 years ago. And a lot of regional authorities signed up to that, a lot of governors, and they want to make their territories a sustainable territory. So there's a lot of political momentum, but it's hard because in some of those very same territories, there's actually very high rates, for example, of deforestation. So political will is not enough. And I think a very important complement of that is to bring in the private sector. And by private sector, I mean a multinational like Unilever or Cargill, but also a cooperative or a farmers association, the whole spectrum. And we need to be able to really leverage the power of value chains, of supply chains, to help shift to more sustainable practices. Because if we're able to have those shifts come around, that can really deliver lasting and durable change in the both, and this is important, not just then in the productive side, which is what you and I have been talking about, but also triggering much more demand for sustainably produced commodities and products from the consumer side. And at the end of the day, we need to have the push and pull of the producers and the demand, the supply and the demand to really transform these value chains. And if we get that right, if we get the incentives right, if we get the price signals right, a greater recognition and a willingness for markets to price sustainably produced crops in an appropriate way. And then on top of that, if we're really working at an entire landscape level so that we can access climate finance or other forms of payment for results or payment for ecosystem services, this will generate with the supply chains and these supply chains that can really harness the market dynamics, generate the additional resource streams and incentives we need to bring about the durable chain. So as you see, there's many different elements that can come into this equation. And I think more and more organizations around the world, multilateral banks, you name it, organizations like the World Wildlife Fund or TNC, the World Bank, are all really trying to push and advance much more these kinds of jurisdictional approaches.
Well, I note that in the crafting of the Sustainable Development Goals that you were a key early leader in really founding that new movement, but it has all of these components. It has responsible consumption. It has the goal of zero hunger. It has response in terms of water above ground and below ground, gender equity, other issues. It seems like somewhere in that process of discussing what should be our aspirational goals, this 15-year goal to 2030, you came up with a 17th goal, partnerships, a little different than zero hunger, than good health and well-being for all. It was a way of describing how you thought we would be able to get there. Can you give us a little flavor of that in this central focus on climate and food security?
Sure. I think partnerships are key. I mean, what we're trying to do is bring about systems change. And that's really hard to do. If I can say right now, when we talk about COVID and what the response should be, we talk about build back better. And I'm begging everybody to not build back better. We need to build back differently. Because if we just do the same thing that we've been doing better, we're still going to be in the bind that we're at. And so getting to build back differently means a need for very transformative partnerships, because nobody can bring about those kinds of systems change by themselves. So when I talk about, for example, these sustainable supply chains, right, and creating these supply sheds, sustainable supply sheds across entire jurisdictions, you need very, very intense partnerships. You need to have an alignment of private sector actors, both the ones that have a bigger pull and bigger clout in the market. We need to leverage the farmers associations, and the producers, also as a way of creating multipliers on the ground. We need to very much engage local authorities that are 100% behind this, with the right policy signals at both local as well as national levels. And then there has to be, for many of these, particularly commodities like beef or cacao or soy, a lot of the right signals at an international level. So we're talking about not only many different entry points, but many different scales of action. And at every single one of those intersections, we need those partnerships. And we also need the partnerships because we have to bring in many different voices. You mentioned gender. Women play a fundamental role in these shifts and in all of these transitions. But since we're talking about food systems, women play a key role, as do youth. One of the key challenges, I think, coming out of COVID is a fourth crisis. We have the biodiversity crisis, climate change crisis, and the pandemic. A fourth crisis that I'm speaking to is what I call the generational setback. And that is that we have an entire generation of youth that are going to be, whose educational trajectories and livelihood opportunities are being really impacted by the pandemic, by the lockdowns, by the difficulty in continuing to access education. A lot of girls have fallen out of the school systems and may remain out of the school systems. So part of really addressing these challenges, particularly in rural settings, will be to address and to generate livelihood opportunities for youth. Because otherwise, what's happening in Colombia and in many other parts of the world, there's just this big outflow of the talent, of the energy, of the dynamism that youth bring to cities outside of exactly those spaces where we could have very vibrant landscapes if we manage it right. And for that, we need partnerships. So it is all about sort of radical partnerships.
Thank you so much for giving us that inspirational look at how the partnerships can help lift us, this COVID, the crisis that you've described. Thank you for your leadership in the global level and your home country in Colombia, but at the global scale. And I look forward to our next conversation, but I also know that you're finishing up a book about where the SDGs are going. And so we'll be looking forward to that. So thank you again, Paula Caballero from RARE. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure, and look forward to our next conversation.
Welcome back, everyone, wherever you're watching from around the planet. Global Minnesota's World Food Day 2021 Symposium is focusing on food security and the impact of the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, and conflict between and across borders on food security, and why have we seen such a large increase in the number of people planet-wide who are insecure in their food. This morning in the program, we saw and heard about the big picture. This afternoon, we're looking at the solutions, the success stories, the ways that people are tackling food security and simultaneously addressing the underlying causes. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Ramey from the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. He's the climate resilience planner, bringing those skills and scientific training to that question of how do we become resilient to what the climate crisis is causing and creating in our lives today. And Tim Rhodd, who's the chairman of the executive committee of the tribe, the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. He's in his third term, and he's really passionate and clear about how agriculture is the solution, but also the ways that doing agriculture in some ways has been a cause of the problem. And in the Iowa tribe, as he educated me, the word for soil is about the skin of the earth. And so I'm just so pleased, Chairman Rhodd, to have you here in your role, both as the executive leader of the tribe, but also your passion as a leader in agriculture. I'm handing the microphone over to you to hear about your success stories and how you're taking on this challenge of this climate crisis.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. It's a pleasure being here. It's definitely been a long journey for the Iowa tribe and Iowa farms. I've been in leadership since 2007, and I've been an integral part of the farming operation back in 2007 all the way up through today. And what I've seen over those 14 years is a competition between neighbors and other farmers and other producers, who can raise the highest yield, and what I've learned over those 14 years is it takes a lot of inputs and a lot of dollars to raise a monoculture crop that doesn't really come back to the tribe and the members for food. So one of the biggest issues that we're faced with here in Kansas and Nebraska on our reservation is we've got producers that is putting on the harmful nitrogen source, which is anhydrous ammonia. And, that nitrogen source is very detrimental to the soil biology, because the soil is alive. There's living and functioning organisms throughout the soil that has to work in a symbiotic relationship to provide, the food to those organisms and to the plants and to the animals and which in turn, turns back to us for our protein sources. So, and what we did is we changed our model. We took a good hard look at where our dollars were going out, and a lot of those were chemicals and fertilizer. So what we did is we start with the soil, and there's 6 soil health principles. Number 1 is know your context. You've got to know what you're farming for. And we as a tribe are farming now for our membership and the community to provide more healthy, nutrient-dense quality food to those individuals. Number 2 is cover the soil. Mother Earth, her skin, is the top of the soil that we walk on and what we see every day. And we've got to keep her covered because, it's what we've done is put, cover crops in, not only to feed the biology, but to keep her covered so we don't have that evaporation rate that we're facing issues today. So number 3 is the minimum soil disturbance. This is where we as producers have made a big mistake. Through tillage and plowing, it has degraded and disturbed that soil. And, we've got to keep that intact as much as possible. And through heavy tillage, from our operation, what we've done is we've disrupted that system, and basically we're not able to infiltrate water. The soil should be just no different than a carbon filter that we have on our faucets. That water should be infiltrating down through the soil, through the pore spaces, and getting back down to the aquifer. Number 4 is increased diversity. Hundreds of years ago, how this environment used to be, it was lands just full of natural habitat and different varieties of plant species. And, I always use this as an example. Hundreds of years ago when the bison had, roamed across all of these areas, they've grazed those areas, and they weren't stuck on a certain amount of perimeter fence to where they overgraze and overstock sometimes. So increase in diversity, it also helps with feeding the soil biology with keeping a living root in the soil 24/7, 365 days a year. Those plants will actually, through the root exudates, will feed the biology. And then the last is integrate livestock. And this is, where I've talked about, years ago when the bison and the wild animals had roamed through here. We've seen a quick turnaround on our soil biology, and also our organic matter is increasing. We're not having to put in as much nutrients back into the soil. So integration of livestock is very helpful. Our old model was conventional farming, monoculture, heavy tillage. We were chasing yields and profits. But, when you look at the bottom line of your whole operation, it's the bottom line that is what really matters, because we've got to farm in a way that we can self-sustain ourselves. And right now, for the Iowa tribe in its old model, there was all those dollars going out and really nothing coming back. So the lack of biodiversity in the cropping systems, that was an old model of ours. And we've spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last 14 years that I've been here, just trying to fix the soil erosion. Because what we do, Mother Earth and her skin, if we can keep her protected and that living plant 24/7, 365 days a year will actually keep that soil intact to where a lot of, when it rains, we have heavy rains here and a lot of those nutrients and, the topsoil is being eroded away and washed down through the creeks and the streams and the river. And, we can't get that back. One of the biggest exports in agriculture today, and a lot of people don't realize this, is topsoil. And if we think about that just for a minute, exporting topsoil, there's 50 to 60 years that they're predicting that we will not have enough topsoil here. And without that topsoil, it's going to be very, very hard to grow the food that our community and our membership needs, to survive. And, through COVID, this last couple of years, it was, access to food was insecure. It was here on our reservation, where we've got to travel, 30 miles to go to the nearest grocery store. So what we're doing is we're focusing on the soil biology. We are adding more food production throughout our land, which will in turn be able to provide all of that nutrient dense quality food that our members need. We're gonna outsource that. We're actually in the process right now of expanding one of our C-store operations here on our reservation. And, through that, we will actually be able to have better access to food. So that's pretty rewarding to see this transition, not only economically, but for the better health of the soil, the community, the land, the water, and, overall that long-term goal is what we're trying to fix is, human health amongst our membership. And we as Native Americans, years ago, we were hunters and gatherers, and we ate the foods that were in season and we had access to. So what is happening out in our farming operation and has been for a number of years is, we are farming in a way that is detrimental to the land, the water, the air, and our human health. And I give this an analogy from what I've seen here throughout the years is, we keep adding nutrients, the nitrogen, the chemicals, and the fertilizer to the land. And what is happening, it's degraded that soil system, right? And, we're seeing an increase in diseases. We have pests coming in, we have a fungicide coming in, we have, there's just all these different increase in diseases. And it's actually, I believe, is what we are adding to the land, and it's disturbing and disrupting the soil biology. And we as humans, with the gut microbiome in ourselves, with all the processed foods and, the things that we eat and the sugars and stuff, is having an impact on the gut microbiome of us. And that's where we're actually seeing these diseases increase in our systems as well. I'd like to share one more example, and it's kind of the economic model of how we're able to transition from a monoculture into a more of a food production polyculture system. And this is pretty neat and very successful project that we started. And, Brett Ramey, tribal member, has introduced us to a company from Lawrence, Kansas that is making tofu. Now, the end comparison here on this tofu bean, which is a organic seed. There was no seed treatment with an insecticide on that seed, and it was planted into standing rye. And we are actually going to be getting, $33 to $34 per bushel out of this product. So, just this one small 80-acre tract that we grew these soybeans for this customer, we're going to be doing that across the whole landscape and every farming operation that we have and every tract of land that we have. And, eventually what I foresee is transitioning out of this monoculture into more food production, a healthier food production, because we've actually did not put any inputs, any nutrients to grow this crop, because all of the nutrients was in the soil because of the different practices that we're instilling here. So, we're correcting several different things here. We're not adding a herbicide. We're not adding a fungicide. We don't have to add the inputs and nitrogen and all the nutrients that it takes for these plants to grow. So we're decreasing those input dollars that cost the operation money. And at the end, $13 to $14 a bushel in the old model, $33 to $34 a bushel on the new model. So we're actually decreasing the input cost, increasing the revenue, which means more dollars in our pocket.
Great. Brett, it seems like this is a really important way forward that solves many of the problems that have been underlying the economic, the ecological.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, Chairman Rhodd named a lot of those intersecting issues throughout what he shared, from health of land to health of our gut microbiome, and how those things can't be considered separate. And so I think that's one of the roles that we have as Indigenous communities, and what other people can learn from is we don't live in a world, traditionally, that separated things out in that way, where we always knew that the health of one thing relied on the health of the other. And if we're polluting our water, for short-term economic gain, ultimately we're going to be paying the price, short and or long-term, in the health of our bodies, the health of the land, all of these things. And so I'm just so excited and proud of what our tribe is doing, under Chairman Rhodd's leadership, along with members of the farm team who are seeing the need to transition into different practices, and how largely a lot of those practices, while the specifics might look different, right? The roller crimper going over the rye cover crop, we didn't have roller crimpers, that we were pulling behind buffalo back in the day. But nonetheless, like, the values and the general ethic behind it is still the same. It's very much, traditional values that are being carried forward. And I think another kind of key piece to that, in talking specifically about these soybeans, is that, kind of that ethic of relationships being kind of a primary, of primary importance. So relationships across, health of land, health of people, like I just restated, but also relationships regionally with customers, with other community members who are going to then have the opportunity to benefit from eating these foods as well. And so I think, that ends up being part of one of my roles as the climate resilience planner for the tribe, is kind of, taking a bird's eye view of our economy, our lands, our human health, and trying to find these intersection points again to bring them all back in together to this more cohesive, healthy whole. And so that ends up being that I get to, make connections between, what the tribe is doing, in agricultural practices, and helping find, customers through different networks and relationships. In this case, the tofu factory here in Lawrence, Kansas, which is 80 miles away from our reservation. And so as we're continuing to think about, what does it look like to reinstate our traditional practices, traditional values into the landscape as part of this broader climate resilience, ultimately it looks at, how we continue to view ourselves as humans within this broader ecosystem of the cattle, of the beans, of the water, of the carp even, right? And so how do these kind of, quote, invasive fish, end up actually serving to benefit and further our goals as humans, in the reservation, but is ultimately benefiting everything else as well that lives and depends on that same soil and water that we do. And as we've heard recently, there's been reports that suggest that 80% of remaining biodiversity is in indigenous lands. And so that alone right there signals to the absolute necessity for everyone to kind of take notice of what our tribe is doing, what all other indigenous peoples are doing around, because within our respective ways of doing things, we do hold a lot of these solutions that address the climate impacts that we're seeing globally, right? And so as much as we can kind of acknowledge that, yes, like within Western paradigms, Western science, there are very valuable tools that support moving forward. That has to be coupled with a deep understanding that the ethics, values, worldviews that see interconnections, that see the necessity of interrelationships that so many Indigenous peoples hold. Like that is ultimately what is needed, is that shift in thinking, because even just like the tools alone, implementing them within an otherwise system that is just the same that we've always been through is not going to be sufficient. And that's one thing that just wanted to note in relation to this is that today, the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, where we put out a press release for what we call the Restoring Regenerative Agriculture Program. And so I was fortunate to work with RAF to design and lead this funding program that was specifically and explicitly for Black, Indigenous communities of color in the regenerative agriculture space. Many of which don't even use that terminology just because by nature of what they've always been doing, like is regenerative. And so we were able to provide direct support to 15 organizations who are doing this work, who are in their own respective ways, leading in similar ways that Chairman Rhodd mentioned that the Iowa tribe is doing as well. So just invite people to kind of take a look at some of that work the Regenerative Ag Foundation is doing, both in terms of the types of organizations that we are funding that are leading forward with a different ethic, that do see the necessity of soil health and carbon sequestration within their practices. And in addition to that, know that there has to be a different way forward that honors everybody who's working the land. So we're honoring farm workers always. We're always ensuring the health of the soils. We're always ensuring that we're forwarding our ancestral knowledges. And so those are those sort of additional layers that a lot of these organizations bring forward, in addition to the necessary pieces of ensuring healthy soil and healthy ways to address climate impacts through sequestration or otherwise. And so I'm just so happy to be able to learn from those organizations and the way I'm learning from Chairman Rhodd and others within our tribe to really put forward some other ways of doing things, and not just the what they're doing, but actually the how we're doing it and the ethics we're leading through, which is ultimately, I would suggest, more important than some of the specific practices even. So I just appreciate being able to be with you all and share a little bit today.
Chairman Rhodd and Brett Ramey, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience, but also giving a hopeful message about the logic of leaving behind certain things that are damaging our climate and moving towards climate solutions that are also healthy for people and for the planet. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Very welcome. Thank you. I'm honored and humbled to be a part of this, and looking forward to, telling the story, and, because it is a model that can be implemented anywhere. It's just following those soil health principles and practices. After that, everything's going to work together for the greater good at all. So we've got to quit living for yesterday. And today and tomorrow, we've got to start looking out as Native communities, those 7 generations that we should be preparing for and looking ahead that many years. That's where we're going to make these changes. And we cannot do that until we educate ourselves in a different type of model of farming. So it was a pleasure being a part of this today. And, I look forward to the message getting sent out to all over the country, because this can be implemented anywhere. So thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. And we're looking at the climate impacts on food security, food insecurity, and solutions that are addressing both the short and long term. I'm thrilled to have my next guest and would invite him onto the screen, Dr. Eduard Muller from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is really maybe the world leader on decarbonization, on addressing the greenhouse gas emission, but also thinking about all the different sectors, food and agriculture and transportation. Your role as president and founder of the University of for International Cooperation has put you at a pivot point in Costa Rica's making this transformative effort inside of Costa Rica and becoming a global leader. Can you share with us how the society moved together to make Costa Rica such a North Star for the planet?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Mark, to be part of this. Costa Rica is different. Maybe because in 1948 we abolished the military, and a lot of money was put into health and education. And in the 80s, we were one of the first countries to establish a Ministry of Environment. And I think it's one of the few countries that has gone from 21% forest cover to more than half of the country now covered with forest. So there is a high level of environmental awareness. But we've had a series of governments and a series of international policies that have been pushing the same policies from other countries that have been very detrimental for the environment. So Costa Rica is at the same time one of the highest consumers of pesticides per person in the country, in the world. So we have this dichotomy of reality and the dream that we pursue. But at the same time, it allows us to have focus on us, have the lights shining on the country. And that is what we're trying to use when we walk the path of regenerating the country at a country level. And this has come to inspire other countries. We now have Colombia. Yesterday, we launched Chile, Regenerative. We have Mexico. Denmark has joined. So I think we will be able to show country at a time and all countries together that we have to do things differently.
And so the specific ways that you've tackled agriculture, and I was not aware of that heavy pesticide use and have only visited a few times, but I can see that in the world of agriculture and food and all of that, there are different forces. So within Costa Rica, there were decisions taken, and now it's more forested. There's new available kind of crops and cropping practices. Do you see the strength of that movement with these new countries and new, I'd say, spotlight, as you mentioned, giving Costa Rica the strength to just carry on and to continue to lead by example for the rest of us?
Well, yes, inspiration comes from Buck Fuller. Don't try to fight the system, just make a better one, and the other one will become obsolete very quickly. We try to fight the pineapple industry and the banana industry, which are the highest uses of pesticide. They're killing our biodiversity. They're killing our children with cancer and other diseases. And it's still pushed because it's one of the most important export products. I think Costa Rica is the largest exporter of pineapple in the world. So, of course, government doesn't want to give this up. And of course, these big corporations that are behind that, they find it easier to use all these chemicals. So what we've done is actually demonstrate that we can not only produce high quality food, abundant food, high diversity. We're doing intercropping, multi-cropping with 30, 40 different crops in beds, a tremendous recovery of the soil health. We've had insect populations bounce back. Amazingly, 2 months after we started the process, we just see these insect populations bounce back. So we're bringing back biodiversity. We're capturing carbon in the soil. We hope to have sensors next year that we can demonstrate this at a large scale. And we're producing really good and abundant quality food for people that didn't have what to eat. We're mostly now in this area of Guanacaste, which depended on tourism. Tourism locked down overnight. So these people were kicked out of their jobs without a bank account, without food production in the area. And we were told you can't produce food with people that have no experience and all these degraded soils in Guanacaste. We're producing now 8 to 10 tons of food per hectare, managed by communities that are learning agriculture, regenerative agriculture. This has been inspired by the Cuban model. Felix Cañet was one of the founders of the Cuban food security process early 90s. He's the dean of our One Health School, and we're now incorporating Mel Landers with indigenous agriculture. So Mel has been recollecting experiences from indigenous agriculture for over 50 years. And we're just combining this with food forests, all these other alternatives. And soil erosion was mentioned before in the talk before. Costa Rica loses, as Central America, about 200 tons of topsoil per hectare per year. That's 20 to 30 dump trucks loaded with soil and dumped into the rivers, which end up in our oceans, killing our reefs. So we can actually reverse the planetary degradation by producing better food. And we bring in self-esteem. We're working on culture. Our regenerative development process links politics, bringing younger people into politics. The spiritual level, we bring social and cultural regeneration, environmental and economic regeneration. So by focusing on local production, local consumption, our tourism is starting to become regenerative tourism, which is actually inclusive of the local communities. Sustainable tourism that didn't include the local communities, really. They were just, in the gardens or cleaning the rooms. Now we're really bringing a holistic approach to a bioregional development that will bring communities to participate in the development, empower them to make decisions. And it's amazing to see these women talking that they don't need any psychological assistance anymore, because we did set up a psychological assistance for all the trouble the trauma they were going through. We see these kids just so excited, learning. We see people really coming together and working again in solidarity. So instead of competing, we're actually collaborating. We see one community farm preparing plants to give to another community farm. So it's this whole mix, which makes better money, makes better food, and we really reverse the planetary boundaries we've exceeded. It's a win-win-win-win.
I think this is the thing that's been the most inspiring. And of course, one of your at least temporary export is young, brilliant leaders who go around the planet and lead international bodies or international conferences or whatever. And the rest of us pick up on their wisdom, their experience, their insights. I'm wondering the role of the university. And can more people access that because it's now virtual and they could get online? How could that become even more dynamic?
Yeah, I founded the university in 1994 to implement sustainability. So bringing environment, society, and economics together. Very soon, we transitioned to bringing culture, politics, and spirituality into the sustainability framework. About 10 years ago, we started working on regeneration. We realized sustainability wasn't there anymore. That train left already. But we started migrating to online education back in 1996. So we have students in over 60 countries and graduates in over 60 countries. Now we have brought together some tremendous alliances, for example, with Ubiquity University, Green Project Management, Donut Economics Action Lab, a lot, Savory Institute, Capital Institute. So we're now networking. We launched a master's in regenerative action. We're launching the Global Regeneration Corps, where we expect to be able to train thousands of children around the planet, young people around the planet, to become first responders for regeneration. We need to scale this up by millions of times. It's just a question of funds and scaling to be able to get around the world with armies of young regenerators, really showing differences to their neighbors. We tried to convince chemical farmers to move away from chemical farming. It was impossible. So we picked 20 of their kids and started regenerative farming with them. And now the parents are realizing the kids are making a lot more money, producing better food, not depending on these chemical companies to throw their money into. So they start looking and they start changing. So it's just showing with cattle production, a lot of people are saying we need to get rid of cattle. The previous speaker said bringing animals actually increases fertility, increases soil carbon. And we have done that. And we have farms that have been monitored even before us by the Ministry of Agriculture. They're producing 1 centimeter of topsoil per year with cattle. We're now doubling the amount of cows in a farm and reducing the area for the cattle by giving area back to biodiversity. So they're making more money. So we don't really have to convince them. They're coming to us because they can double their production and serve as a really important carbon sink.
What are the sensors that you referenced before that you might have next year?
Okay, there are groups working on sensors to be able to determine carbon almost in real time. And I really can't say much more than that, but that will actually be the game changer. And together with the training programs we're developing, we launched the first certificate on regenerative entrepreneurship at the university in 2019. Every one of these students that graduated from that, I'm not talking students, all 18-year-olds, we had students over 60 years old, have changed their life and now are regenerating. So bringing these tools will actually allow us to make things a lot more effective. But it's a nature-based solutions. It's biomimicry, actually building biomimicry, applied biomimicry, not only material biomimicry, but looking at how nature has solved things for millions of years. And that brought into educational programs changes the mindset of students. And we need to move away from the reductionist approach. We need to get students to unlearn and actually be able to then really have action in regeneration. And that it goes across every single activity. It's not only environment, it's not only agriculture, it's not only biodiversity, it's economics, it's local development, it's tourism. You name it, we need to work holistically.
Culture and spirituality, you also mentioned that before. I can see that you're thinking very long term. And so I'm going to make a hypothesis that you've started thinking about and perhaps already started working on what kind of North Star might we want on the other side of the 2030 timeframe of the current Sustainable Development Goals. Your work on the millennial goals and then moving forward, the work on the sustainable goals. We're within striking distance. We won't make them all. We will want a continued emphasis looking ahead. Kind of governance by goals has really taken hold of our hearts and our minds. What are you folks working on there? What are you imagining you might do in helping lead a global conversation on that what's next?
Well, we're actually already in that global conversation. In the economic part, we launched Bounce Beyond a year and a half ago. That's new economies for local development. We have the Regenerative Communities Network with Capital Institute, which already has 15 countries, and new countries are coming in. So bioregions collaborate to regenerate and co-create solutions for regeneration. So it's all over, moving way beyond our borders. And okay, yes, the Sustainable Development Goals will help, but again, we need to demonstrate. It's enough talking. We just have to show that we can do things differently, make it better, and have people actually do it, not talk about it. I'm not really willing to spend time talking about and going to these forums and going to the big conventions and more blah, 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 as Greta said, and it's really has to come to action. So we don't need rocket science. I always say this is the best scientifically documented planetary extinction. We know exactly, we have the science to know why we're gonna go kaput. We just have to turn all this to wisdom and show that it happens.
When I was young, Buckminster Fuller gave the convention or the graduation speech at a small college near my little hometown in Iowa. And I went over to see him because I had fallen in love with domes and I had built domes. And what I remember about that day, it was a sunny Iowa summertime, was somebody who wanted to make sure that there were young people alive and out all over the world, just excited about taking the world to a better place. I feel that same passion in you. I feel that same vision. I'm looking forward to all the other ways we might collaborate and work together. My life was changed by some young women leaders who from Costa Rica said, well, you know, we don't have an army. I said, what? They said, yeah, and we've kind of changed our agriculture. I said, what? They said, yeah, but we're behind that. We got to change transportation now. And I go, oh, and so having that experience of meeting my new teachers and having this opportunity today to talk to you just gives me a sense of some opportunities that we have to find these dynamics. And I'm the lucky one in my state where there's lots of action and lots of things going on. And I feel energized and inspired when we can connect on action, but also on that commitment down into the long term. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. And I'm looking forward to coming and visiting you whenever it's safe and sound, and to be part of that transformation you're leading there. And sometime when we're doing some fun things here, having more of those young leaders and perhaps yourself come see and be part of our process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the possibility of having this conversation. Actually, I'm not willing to learn how to adapt to a changing planet. Climate change adaptation, I think, is a big mistake. We still have time to co-create a future together. And nature has shown us, with the vacation we gave it last year, that it is willing to keep on collaborating with us. So let's build a future and not learn how to live in a collapsing planet.
Amen. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.